without wanting to step on the toes of the practical aspect of this get-together, I want to kind of see a show of hands, if you don't mind my asking you. How many are here strictly for the practical, and there's no, Mike, if I can get your agreement to this, I don't know where you are already, there you are. I thought I already did something wrong. If you don't mind, we're not going to hold anyone to this, but how many came mostly for the practical tips, skills and things that you can pick up? Can I see a show of hands if that's sort of the primary interest is, you know, I need extra help with the dairy farm or whatever. I came, I don't know which workshop I should be at, Mike, but I came for help with my sheep. I do try to put a little bit of my money where my mouth is, if you forgive the financier's cliche. I have a few acres at home, 75 head of sheep, about 50 chickens. I'm never quite sure because I'm not good at any of it, so the last time I checked my spreadsheet, I go out to the flock or the, what's the group of chickens in a flock too? What do you call them? Flock? Bevy. There's also, so you should look up the word bevy in a dictionary. It's a good word to hold on to in our age of, you know, feminism and trans this and that. But I go out to the flock and I count them, and the number never matches what's in the spreadsheet because inevitably some have died since I last visited them. And that's my problem, so I would like some practical advice on that. But I'm, in a certain way, Mike, I'm happy to see that there were really only a few hands saying, oh, I just came for one tip from the dairy farmer. This is a more intrusive and intentionally personal question, so please be honest, because I took my glasses off, I can't see who's who, so there's no, this is not going to be held against you. But how many came because they already firmly believe, are firmly committed to the notion that to live out one's Catholic faith and one's vision of what Catholic culture, society, etc., whether it be small potatoes in the home or much larger, raise your hand if you would, if you are already fervently, firmly committed to the idea that being on the land in some way and living in a more natural way than, say, your regular daily wage slave is almost obligatory, or at least it's a very natural conclusion from being a Catholic. How many people would say they feel that way? And that's good, that's very good. Now I would like to know if you didn't, and I cannot recognize your faces, so please don't feel under any pressure. Put your hand up just to get us a metric of numbers if you didn't raise your hand in answer to the last question. Thank you. So, brother, really? Do you want me to restate the questions? Because I know.
I was looking up bevy.
Yeah, okay, good. Oh, he was busy with the dictionary. Last time I checked, it's group of small birds or women is what the word bevy means. It's a very good word. What's that? Mostly quail. The women or the birds? Okay, so the reason I made the reference to John the Baptist is because I think about 12 people maybe raised their hands saying, no, I'm not really committed about the Catholics and the land and all that. So my keynote really is addressed to the 12 people. So everyone else, if you'd like to leave and get in an extra rosary, please be my guest. More to the point, how many of those that raised their hand in answer to, where are we now? Question number 2, namely, you're already committed to the idea that living on the land is a demand of your Catholic faith. For those of you who are in that category, would it be helpful, hand up if the answer is yes, to hear a little sales pitch as to why that's true? Okay, few more and I'll go on. Okay, so that's all I do. I don't raise sheep well, I don't raise chickens well, I can't keep my dogs from killing my chickens, I can't keep parasites from killing my sheep. I'm learning, I'm old, I'm running out of time. I will not have it figured out in time to save all of them. But as Mike mentioned, what I did do by the grace of God was join the Navy in 1989. And in the early to mid 90s, I should say it's mid to late 90s, I was stationed, I'm just gonna go over here because I feel like you're neglected over here. I'll be back. In the mid to late 90s, I was assigned overseas in Naples, Italy, where they have the only place, it's the only place in the world where pizza is made properly. And I'm sorry if that's offensive, just please get over it as best you can, because it's true. I met an Irishman there who was a radical in the sense of the word radice, root. In other words, a fervent Catholic, I'm not going to give you his name because he would not want me to give you his name, because if you look him up, brother, next to Bevy, you'll find terrorist, radical, nutcase, white supremacists, etc. You know, people who are very committed to Catholicism in this day and age tend to not be very popular politically. But what he did for me is what apparently I did for Mike, which is he had a whole stack of books on his shelf. McNabb, Chesterton, Harold Robbins, Herbert Shove, A.J. Penty, some non-Catholics even, all of our intellectual forefathers, ancestors, etc., who articulated this vision that after the world at large ceased being Catholic, so how many would say that started about 100 years ago? How many would say 200, 300, 400, 500? We're getting warmer, 600. So Father Fahey, who Mike mentioned, the book is The Church and Farming. Mike, please make a note, The Church and Farming. He says the high water mark of Catholic society was the 13th century. So we can all count 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, we're in 21st, right? So 800 years maybe, 700 to 800 years is when the age of faith started to not be the age of faith anymore. And in the reaction to the distancing between church and society, just like the Jesuits, you know, who were formed really as the shock troops to vindicate the Catholic faith against the claims of Protestantism, a whole slew of Catholic intellectuals, thinkers, priests, laymen, university professors, journalists, opinion leaders. Today, what would we call them today? Like your friend back there, Mike, they're called influencers, right? All these minds got themselves focused on the problem of how do we explain not just why the Catholic faith is true considered in a vacuum, you know, in a catechism or a book of dogmas, but why do the claims that the church makes regarding how society should be organized, why are those claims themselves true? And why do we need to speak them from the housetops so that all Catholics can learn to live again in that way? How many of us know that the Catholic faith does have a more or less coherent position on questions of politics, economics, society? How many would say, yeah, okay, that's good. So that's maybe less than half. So again, the half of you can stick around. The rest are free to go. So in this trajectory of the world falling away from the faith, the intellectuals respond to it. One of the unfortunate things in history is the Catholic reaction is always, in a certain respect, reactionary. We're always responding. We know that dogma evolves that way, right? Our Lord provides the deposit of faith. We're all kind of at ease with that. Then someone starts with an error. Could be very subtle. And it takes a long time, humanly speaking, for the machinery of doctrine and doctrinal refinement, clarification to get in motion to refute particular errors. Like the biggest one that comes to my mind immediately is the error about the natures of our Lord. Human, God, what's the relationship? That wreaked havoc, as we know, east and west, especially east, for centuries. And the same thing happens with the Industrial Revolution, which, as we know, follows Protestantism, in between which, between Protestantism and Industrial Revolution, which is principally a technological thing, in between there is that middle intellectual space where we go from sort of bumper sticker dogma, Immaculate Conception, Resurrection, Virgin Birth, the three persons of the Trinity, two natures of Christ, blah, 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 all the little catechism pamphlets that we all teach our kids and, you know, correspondence courses and all that. And then over here, of course, Industrial Revolution, principally technologies, you know, the flying shuttle for the loom, spinning jenny, steam engine, etc. In between, there is that mind space, if you will, the content of thought, which talks about what is the relationship with church and state. More precisely, what is the relationship between the authority of the church and the state, or lay people in general? Does the church have anything to say to lay people about how they should live as lay people? Or can the church only tell them how to live as Catholics? More to the point, is it possible as a Catholic lay person to separate the notion of living as a lay person from living as a Catholic? Is there such a thing as a Catholic lay person who says, well, no, this is my layperson life, not my Catholic life? My answer to that question is, of course there is, because in this space between Reformation and Industrial Revolution, you have what we would call classical liberalism. And it's important to understand that what that really means is a number of things, but the basic principles are reason, what man can know in the natural order, divorced from the sovereignty, if you will, of the Catholic faith, divorced from the idea that dogma ultimately trumps reason. It's not contrary to reason, but there are things that Catholicism tells us that we can't know from our reason. And so when we get a little off track in the reason department, the Catholic faith is there to rectify it. That's the Church's approach to even modern science as well. We're all fine with this concept, right? We know this is how it works. Or if it's new to you, I hope that you're not hostile to this idea. But after the Reformation, when the Christians who kept Christ but got rid of the church started thinking about things, they started thinking, well, I'm really free to think whatever I want because I don't have the church, which is the human instrument that our Lord put on the earth to fix man's erroneous thinking. And remember when he left to go back into heaven, he said, go ye therefore and teach all nations, teaching them all things whatsoever I have commanded. So our Lord commands us to believe things, but he also commands us to do things. We must know and believe the Catholic faith. We must behave in a moral way. But in this middle space, once the Christians are liberated from the control of Catholic doctrine, they start to think, well, what's the limit? There is no limit. So economic life, for example, which in the Middle Ages was looked at as a way of meeting those 5 primary things that Mike talks about, getting what they would call a frugal comfort. Enough to survive becomingly, not in abject poverty, but not overflowing with wealth. The Protestant Christians or post-Protestant pseudo-semi-Christians would say, well, I don't think there's any reason for me to limit the wealth that I can acquire. When I go into economic life, when I start producing something, the purpose of production is not to meet those 5 needs, but it's to become wealthy and to become rich. Then when I become rich, I have gobs of money and I can build a factory and I can use the machinery that then comes along in the Industrial Revolution to make things more quickly and more cheaply in my factory. And then what are the social consequences? The social consequences are that the homesteads that Mike is working so hard to try to promote and to try to build a structure where they're able to flourish, those homesteads are quickly run out of business because what the factory cranks out is so much more cheaply and in a certain respect more efficiently made than what the homestead can keep up with. Another couple of points, the factory is making for a gigantic market. The factory's not making for what can be consumed right outside the factory door. The factory is making, these days, and well before as well, is producing for a market that is around the globe. So this natural connection between the family and economic life starts to be broken as soon as the mentality creeps in that the economic process is not to meet the needs of the family, but it is to become wealthy. And there are 1,000 interim steps and 1,000 interim points that mark this transition and that are essential for understanding how this transition happens. We'll go back to my original question to all of you. What came you here to hear? Hear, H-E-R-E, H-E-A-R. I hope this is, in a certain respect, not news to you, but I also hope it's fruitful because my own experience with the sheep and the chickens and the rest of it is it's very hard work. Certain respect, economically, it's not strictly necessary. I can go to the Giant or to Walmart and buy Purdue chicken breasts instead of dealing with all the difficulties at home. I can get lamb from Costco and probably save 3 times the amount of money it takes me to raise and then watch a sheep die from a parasite. The kids, they're great, they're interested in one respect, but there's the allure of the modern world, there's technologies, there's universities, some of them even have the nerve to go off and get married and move far away and not stick around and help me on the farm. You know, there's all these downsides, so it's difficult. And what I'm trying to provide for those of you who like the historical, intellectual, ideological formation is there is more of a reason to do what you are doing than strictly, I want some tips on dairy farming, or I prefer, living out in the country. I don't want to hear airplanes flying over because I'm near an airport. This, if you accept, and I think you must because it's historically true, if you accept this narrative that I've outlined in terms of how we go from the ages of faith to Protestantism, to liberalism, to the Industrial Revolution, and what the Catholic reaction is to that, I submit to you that what you're doing is absolutely part of that Catholic reaction. And I would submit even further that there's an argument to be made that it is obligatory on all, especially the Catholic laity. The religious have their own, we're blessed here to have religious who are engaged in this work, but they also serve us and they serve the church in ways that are beyond what we as lay people can do. So we have our own vocation and our own calling, which is to get to work properly understood on the militant reaction to the drifting away of the world from the Catholic faith. And part of the way we do that, obviously there's liturgy, there's prayer, there's sacraments, spiritual reading, spiritual life, etc. But part of the way we do that is we delve deeply into a way of life that is compatible with the Catholic faith, and more to the point, is a part of the historical movement which rejects all of these tendencies and opposes all of these tendencies that I have spoken about. So I'm going to take a breath for a minute. I want to see right off the bat if there's any questions, any comments, anything, anyone saying, I just don't follow it, I don't buy it, you're nuts, say whatever you want, thick skin, I've heard it all. Okay, that means we're all free to go, right? You're convinced. Mike, what time limit would you like me to observe? You have your, I hope you haven't lost the clock, because that would be, the rosary won't start till midnight. Just tell me when you want me to wrap up. I'll say a few more things and try to bring it, back to what we're going to be doing tonight, tomorrow, and the next day. Whole half an hour, that's bad news. So let's think a little then, if I'm assuming because I didn't get any negative feedback, I'm assuming that this kind of general outline I've given you is you're persuaded by it, you already knew it, hopefully you're enthused about it. Dorothy Day, if I mention the word Dorothy Day, who raises their hand in disgust and says, oh, feminist, communist, bad. Okay, so there's a few out there, and that's fine. I was going to quote, how about on the other side? Are there any Dorothy Day fans?
She's a mixed bag.
Mixed bag. Brother says she's a mixed bag. Quail or woman? So, one of the things she and Peter Morin used to always say is that before action, one must have rectification of thought. Is that okay? Okay, so that part of Dorothy Day is fine. We'll leave the other controversial parts of it aside. Jean Husset, the great French leader of the Cité Catholique in the 50s and 60s in France, which was a movement against Marxism and the trajectory of the modern world, and had lots of young men and families participating in this social Catholic movement. Because one thing I'll throw out to you is that anytime you have Catholic thinkers, you have a movement. And anytime you have a movement, you have thinkers. And it's the genuine division of labor, not the Adam Smith division of labor. And I always get confused with the metaphor because the anti-scholastics complain that Thomas and his fellow disputants talked about the angels that fit on the head of a pin, but Adam Smith identified, I think, 76 different procedures to manufacture a pin? So I shouldn't get that confused. But the genuine division of labor that we talk about is the vocations and the gifts that St. Paul speaks of. Some have gifts that articulate or express themselves in one way, some have gifts that express themselves in others. And in any social movement, and this is, after all, Mike, it's your label, the Catholic Land Movement, unless you want to blame it on the people you're copying from 100 years ago, which is okay. In any movement, there's always activists, people who are carrying the water, doing the work, handing out the pamphlets, doing the PR. Mike, you're on the news all the time, as I understand it these days. Then there are the spade workers that are in the trenches actually doing the work of the farming and the land and facilitating people going back to the land. And then there's the ideologues like myself who are just constantly on a soapbox haranguing people about why this is important. I'm hoping there's room for all of us in this, it's a shrine, I was going to say big tent. But when it comes to the ideology, I would submit to all of you that as you pick up steam, as this movement picks up steam, be prepared to encounter a certain amount of resistance. So again, I'm trying to keep everyone awake. So if I could get a show of hands, have you ever run into, from family, friends, co-workers, strangers, man on the street, so to speak, any pushback as to why are you, let's say you've moved to a farmstead because you've left your suburban house or whatever, and or you're putting a lot of work into conserving the family farmstead, which you may be fortunate enough to have inherited. Anyone get any pushback, like why are you doing that? Why don't you just live in an apartment, a condo, make it easy? So there's a handful. Many of you are blessed you don't get too much of that. How about controversy, not just in terms of it seems weird, practically it's just hard work and why bother, but how about any controversy in terms of, the politics of today, right? If you, and forgive me for excluding half of the better half of the human race, but if you're a white man, Catholic, you're about at the bottom of the barrel these days, right? That's the way it is. It must be Satan's era because it's obviously upside down. Any of you want to run into commentary along the lines of, well, if you're doing this kind of stuffy, traditionalist, back to the land, primary things, make your own bread instead of shopping at Walmart, you're kind of un-American, or there's got to be something wrong with you. Anyone kind of run into any of that? So you all are fortunate enough, you travel in very different circles, because what I can tell you, and as this movement picks up steam, you will start to hear that. You will start to hear that if you advocate living on the land and close to the land, you are betraying that great spirit and machine of capitalism which defeated the Soviets back in the 1980s, 1990s. You are kind of undermining the entire American spirit. You remember, the business of America is business. This is what we're told by our presidents. Just like England is workshop to the world. These are the things, the myths, if you will, that we Americans sometimes tell about ourselves. And the more you become successful, and success attracts attention, good and bad, the more you will start to hear these kinds of things. And we talk about the gifts of the Holy Ghost, vocations, etc. This is where I come in, is strictly to help you, to provide a service, to make the arguments that need to be made in defense of what you are doing. I will have some books available for you to, I hate to say this, I just gave a rant about capitalism, to purchase, because I have to eat too. Although I'll skip meals this weekend if that makes you feel better. That talk about the different facets of modernity, how we got where we are, how we fell away from the faith, and what the consequences of that is for society. How we have capitalism. Let me just ask a few more questions, keep it interactive, and I'm not going to use the whole 30 minutes. I want to give you at least half of that time back. If I were to say to you that living on the land in a way that unites your production and your consumption on the homestead, in a certain manner of speaking, that is a very non-capitalist, dare I say, anti-capitalist thing to do. How many would agree with me? Okay, so if I were to say that the argument against the connection between land, production, and consumption is really the argument of patriotism. You remember, you're all mixed ages here. Do we remember when, right after 9/11, our illustrious president at that time, who was the son of George H.W. Bush, was interviewed, and he was asked, what can Americans do to help the nation after these horrible assaults by our enemies on 9/11? Anyone remember what he said? Speak up. Go shopping. Go shopping. That's right. So there is a sense that this kind of economic churn is patriotic, and as you run into these arguments, I want to point your attention, as you're browsing this weekend, to resources that we try to make available to you. I mentioned my radical Irish friend that I met when I was in the Navy. I was invited to his house. I looked at the books in his library, the McNabb, Chesterton, Belloc, etc. I said, wow, these are great. I love to read. I enjoy writing a little bit. How does one, get a hold of these? He said, well, they're all out of print. Well, why doesn't someone put them back in print? He says, yeah, good idea. Be my guest. So, okay, I did it. Fine. We have a dozen, 2 dozen titles, whatever. Tim, you know better than I do how many we have. But I was told recently by a colleague who I've been working with for 20 years in this kind of publishing ideological advocacy arena, who said that one of the nice things about these editions that we make available is they always come with fairly thorough introductions that explain what is Chesterton arguing about, what is Belloc arguing about, what's the historical context, of this book, that book, whatever. And in each one of these introductions, I think most of these titles I have with me, you will be exposed, if that's the right term, to what is the argument against someone who says, oh, if you go back to the land, you must be some kind of fascist, stuffy Christian white male who's against all of the modern world. If you go back to the land, you must want to live on a commune, so you're probably a communist or a socialist. You're unpatriotic if you live on the land because you need to be shopping, as we're told by our president. All these arguments are things we run into, and for those of you who enjoy this kind of intellectual engagement, sparring, if you will, I recommend, if I could give you the books, you would be welcome to them. Take them, because I'm more interested in you getting the content and getting the ideas right, so that when you run into your fellow Catholic, fellow nominal Catholic, if you will, who is either not adequately supportive, opposed to what you're doing for one reason or another, that you have that whole picture right in front of you. But it takes study and it takes work. And so here's the last couple of things I'll leave with you as this movement, I hope, under Mike's continued leadership, that I hope it continues to grow. So we mentioned Dorothy Day and we mentioned Husserl. Dorothy Day says rectification, clarification of thought. I think that's a line that she borrowed from Peter Marin, her colleague with Catholic Worker. Husserl's term in this group, this movement that he formed in the 1950s and 60s was ideological formation. If we are going to put cells of activists, and let's be honest, every farm, every family, every working homestead, in a certain way is a cell, call it a seed, use whatever metaphor you want. We are agitating in the proper way, the way one agitates to make bread, butter, all kinds of things involve agitation. Agitation has a bad word because it's usually connected with violence and certainly lawless violence, which no one advocates. But we are agitating. We're supposed to mix things up a bit, and it's certainly what our Lord wanted the apostles to do. So as you are with each family homestead, each seed, each cell of the larger organism of society that's being planted, you must not only do that activist work, but you must form your thought so you can understand as a Catholic why you're doing what you're doing, and so that with the large trajectory of the world, I hate to break it to you because your answers are so good, I really feel like I'm very much preaching to the choir. But I will tell you that outside of these fora, these small nuclei of Catholics who are sincere about what the church teaches about society and economics, and people who are interested in farming, homesteading, bringing production home to the family, there is an entire current of thought on the outside, and it's by far the vast majority. Mike, is Mike still around? There you are. What would be your guess? Throw the net as wide as you possibly can of supporters of this movement, just not even so much your Catholic land movement specifically, but all of the allied, pro-homesteading groups and things. Order of magnitude, are we talking 10,000, 100,000, million? Hundreds of thousands, right, and that's the PR man talking. So I agree in one respect, but we're talking about a nation of 300 million and a globe of, what's the number now, 6 billion, whatever. The trajectory is definitely and has been going in the other direction. Now, we're up to, what's our debt right now? What did we just, did we even impose a new limit? We got rid of the debt limit because we were running up against the very constraining number of 32 million. Right, and now the 32 million has been wiped, and I don't even know if they imposed a new limit. I haven't kept up on the headlines. But once you're at 32, 33, what's a couple $1 trillion between friends? Big deal. So how long this modern system will last is questionable. But assuming it has a way of keeping on, right? It just keeps on. We think there's the collapse of 1929, 2008, etc. It seems like it's magic, and there's probably a certain amount of magic involved of the darker kind. But assuming this continues, we have to have all our ducks in a row, not just your water, your home production, all your necessities, any survivalists out there, all the beans. Mom has stacks of beans in the basement. But we have to have the ideas. We have to have the ideas so that when this opening occurs, and there's openings day after day after day in different venues, we have to be able to articulate not just why we're doing what we're doing, but to come back to the very beginning, why we're doing what we're doing as Catholics. How does Catholicism make a difference? Well, and each event, each step, each scene, each character that comes and goes off the stage is an opportunity for a man to practice virtue, and he's doing it in time. If you don't accept that, buy some of my books and study and reflect and think. If you do, God bless you, but think very hard about this connection. St. Thomas says, why do we have material goods? Why do we have the things that Mike was talking about? Food, clothing, shelter, fuel. I'm missing one of the five, Mike. Water. Okay, fine. I would put that in with food, but fine. Food, clothing, water, shelter, and fuel. Good. Why do we have those things? Thomas says, to enable man to practice virtue. Everything God gave to Adam and Eve in the garden was so that they could practice virtue and remain in the state of grace, which means that for every temporal activity, there is a Catholic perspective on it. One quick example, and then we'll close. Getting the picture, basically, in its theory, but here's the practice. For example, in the Middle Ages, according to the great Italian economist, economic historian, 1934, I believe he's writing, Amintore Fanfani. He was a little too far north to have good pizza, but he was a good thinker anyway. He notes from his research in the archives in Florence about the rules that applied to the medieval guilds. Show of hands if the concept of a guild is familiar. Okay, that's good. All the answers are, you're either being dishonest or just excellent, right on top of it. So one of the rules of the medieval guilds, and think about this, if anyone suffer from the problem of getting junk mail in the mailbox, spam in the email, in the physical mail, carts of recycled paper, going out in the mail every day because of all the garbage that comes in. Fanfani says that he found an old set of guild statutes or rules for how economic life is supposed to work, and how one baker treats his competing baker across the street. And there's actually minutes of the meeting of the aldermen, the officials who used to run the guilds. And he says, he's narrating the results of this meeting. And he says, it's come to our attention that certain members of, say, the Bakers Guild, I don't remember which one it was, have resorted to the foul and infernal practice of having handbills printed, like little flyers, advertising their wares, suggesting that theirs are better than the competition, suggesting that they can be purchased at a lower price, and distributing these around the town so as to attract people to come to their bakery and not the competition. And a practice of this cannot be too strongly condemned. And think this is what our life is, right? Every moment. Buy mine, don't buy his. I'll sell it to you half off, cheaper, etc., etc. Because why? Because in this middle space between the end of Christian doctrine and the technology of the Industrial Revolution, you have thinking saying the purpose of living and working in an economic way is not to meet primary needs, but to make money. If I want to make primary needs, I think to myself, the other baker needs to sell a certain number of loaves so that his family can be sustained. And there's probably enough baking and enough bread selling within the community, if it stays in a very nice balance, to have livelihoods and good bread. That's what the medieval vision is, a balance of livelihoods, families that are sustaining themselves by economic activity, and good products. And when finance becomes supreme, this is the narrative of Father Fahey, Mike, in Your Church and Farming and all his other books, is that production starts to dominate man rather than the other way around, and then money starts to dominate production. When that happens, now I don't care about how many other baking families I put out of business, because the purpose of business is making money, not making bread, and not providing livelihoods. Think of a board meeting in the great telephone companies, Verizon, AT&T, Bell, whatever, the T-Mobile, I don't remember all these things. Think of a CEO saying to the board, I was examining my conscience last night, and I have a message prepared for shareholders. Verizon, for example, we have 55% of the market. And the shareholders are thinking, how are you going to get the other 45? But he says to the board, I think that's honestly too much. There's room for other telecom companies. So I'm going to scale back operations, slash prices, make changes, and give half of our market share over to the competition. That's the medieval way, after all. And the response will be, well, that may be, but that's not how we do it here, so get out. And this is the contrast. This is what we're left with the end of the Catholic ideal. And this is the ideal, the Catholic one, that in your own way, whether you've thought about it or not, or whether you've connected all these dots, this is what you are doing by being here and by living the way you're living, is you are carrying that torch from the 13th, as James J. Walsh says, the 13th, the greatest of centuries, through the genuine Dark Ages, the anti-Catholic Dark Ages of the Reformation, the anti-intellectual ages of classical liberalism, the anti-family and anti-proper production ages of capitalism, the anti-Catholic reaction to capitalism, not going back in the Catholic direction, but making matters worse. You've all heard the phrase, I'm sure. I'm not going to have you waste your time raising your hands because you know the answer. All serious Catholic thinkers refer to communism as state capitalism. It changes nothing, except instead of making 3 or 4 competing corporations the owner of everything, it makes one corporation the owner of everything, namely the government. Doesn't fix anything. It has the same materialist goals, the same lack of concern for health of workers and families. It's just taking it up to the next level. And as Chesterton says, already 100 years ago, when this narrative plays out and gets to the end, you have this strange amalgamation of communism and capitalism, where it's one just super global corporate government thing that no one even knows or can touch or can name. And what's the only resistance to that? It's the flame that was lit in the 1300s when the Catholic thinkers first needed to pay attention to this problem, that's passed all the way through this narrative that I've mentioned, and which is in your hands now to keep lit and to spread. And God bless all of you.
If we had a culture where fatherhood and normal Catholic fraternity existed,